He went on to tell the people this parable. A man planted a vineyard, rented it to some farmers, and went away for a long time. At harvest time, he sent a servant to the tenants so that they would give him some of the fruit of the vineyard. But the tenants beat him and sent him away empty-handed. He sent another servant, but that one also they beat and treated shamefully and sent away empty-handed. He sent still a third, and they wounded him and threw him out. Then the owner of the vineyard said, "What shall I do? I will send my son, whom I love. Perhaps they will respect him." But when the tenants saw him, they talked the matter over. "This is the heir," they said. "Let's kill him, and the inheritance will be ours." So they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. What then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? He will come and kill those tenants and give the vineyard to others. When the people heard this, they said, "God forbid." Jesus looked directly at them and asked, "Then what is the meaning of that which is written? The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces. Anyone on whom it falls will be crushed." The teachers of the law and the chief priests looked for a way to arrest him immediately because they knew he had spoken this parable against them, but they were afraid of the people.
Well, good morning, everyone. Happy St. Patrick's Day. Top of the morning to you. My name is Paul Walker. I serve as the teaching pastor here at TMP, and I want to begin our time together by asking you two questions. By show of hands, here's the first question. How many of you have made a new friend in the last year? Show of hands. Okay, we got some friendly people over here. Friendly, not too friendly in the balcony, got it. Okay, that's great. Now here's the next question that I still think applies to all of us. What was the moment someone moved from being a stranger to a friend? What would you describe as that moment? Is it when you learn their name? Is it when you learn their likes and dislikes? Is it when you knew what they did for work? Is it when you knew their personality type? Well, I actually think the answer to that question is a lot deeper than we think. Now, let me tell you why I think this. You see, back in the day when I was in Bible college, I got a part-time job as a barista at Starbucks. And I worked at the downtown location in Saskatoon. That's not me, in case you were wondering. It was actually a pretty good gig. Like, you get free coffee, amazing benefits, and it had really good flexible hours that worked for me as a student. Plus, I was already spending so much money at Starbucks every week. So now, instead of giving all my money away, they paid me, and I drank all their coffee. Win-win. So one of the things I discovered as a barista is that you can know so much about a person without ever being their friend. You see, at the downtown location, we had a bunch of regular clientele. Every morning, I would see the same people drop in for their morning cup of coffee. Now at Starbucks, part of the corporate culture there is they encourage you to be super friendly. You have to write their name on their cup. You have to, chat them up and make an effort to know people. They literally grade you on this. And so I found myself doing that. And so I knew people's names, I knew their likes and dislikes, I knew what they did for work, and I even over time got a sense of their personality type. Like there was this one guy named Charlie. Charlie was a lawyer in a law firm up the street. And every day at 7:45 a.m., he came into Starbucks and he ordered a black Americano. He was this type A personality guy, and he loved to joke and talk about the weather. Charlie, I knew he was married because he had a wedding band, and I even heard him talk about his kids, so I knew he had kids. He knew my name because, I had to wear a name tag, and I knew his because I had to write it on the cup. But we were not friends. You can know a bunch of facts about a person, but that doesn't mean that they're your friend. So what is the moment that someone moves from stranger to friend? I think it's the moment when you both know each other's stories and you can make new stories together. The moment when you both know each other's stories and you can make new stories together. You see, stories are powerful moments of connection. We heard two this morning. We heard Dan's story. We heard Jane's story. Like, you hear that and you feel connected. Stories are what creates friendship. We are known to each other through story. Donald Miller puts it like this. He says, human brains are wired to respond to narratives. Stories create a sense of connection and engagement, activating various regions of the brain that process emotions, memories, and experiences. So, my friends, is it any wonder that Jesus taught in stories and parables? Is it any wonder that the gospel is a good news story? Stories are powerful. Well, this morning we are turning to yet another story of surrender, a parable called the parable of the Vineyard Tenants. This is a parable that's found in all three of the synoptic gospels. And before we unpack this parable, I think it's actually helpful for us to place it in its historical context, to place it in the story that the Gospel of Luke is telling. Because as the Gospel of Luke introduces this parable, it comes after a series of events. Palm Sunday has already happened. Jesus has come in his triumphal entry, ridden on the foal of a donkey. He's wept over the city. He's gone into the temple and flipped some tables. And now the Gospel of Luke tells us that what Jesus is doing in the final week before his betrayal and crucifixion. We read in verse 47, every day he was teaching at the temple, but the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the leaders among the people were trying to kill him. Yet they could not find any way to do it because all the people hung on his words. One day as Jesus was teaching the people in the temple courts and proclaiming the good news, the chief priests and teachers of the law, together with the elders, came up to him. So basically, all of the religious establishment. Next verse. And he went on to tell the people this parable. So there's this context of like, know the audience. Know the audience. Jesus doesn't just tell this parable by accident. He's directing it at them. In fact, they're all like kind of upset at Jesus. They're wondering where he gets his authority. And Jesus is like, well, where did John the Baptist get his authority? And they're like, well, we're not going to tell you. And Jesus is like, well, I'm not going to tell you either. And then he immediately turns to the crowd, and this is the opening of the parable of the tenants. And so here it is. He, Jesus, went on to tell the people, that's the crowd, the chief priests, the teachers, everybody, a man planted a vineyard, rented it to some farmers, and went away for a long time. This opening line actually tells us a whole lot. Everyone would have already been constructing the story in their head just by that opening line. Because the first thing that story tells us is that this vineyard owner is really, 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 really wealthy. This guy's loaded. This is like a Jeffrey Bezos of his day. Like, people who plant vineyards have a ton of resources to spare. And that's because from planting the vineyard to getting a viable harvest of grapes, it takes about 5 years. And that's true to this day. The vines have to mature and put down roots. And it's only in the 5th year that you begin to get the full maturing of the grapes. It takes a long time to see the fruit of your investment. And not only that, starting a vineyard has a bunch of other startup costs. And we kind of hear this in the Gospel of Mark's version of this parable. It says, a man planted a vineyard, and look at all these other things he does. He puts a wall around it. He dug a pit for the wine press, and he built a watchtower. Money, money, money. And then he rented the vineyard to some farmers and moved away to another place. Building walls, making wine presses, building watchtowers, all of this is a tremendous amount of money. And what's even more amazing is that the vineyard owner moves away, so he's not even sticking around. He's got property elsewhere, and he rents out the vineyard to a bunch of Farmers, plural, not farmer, singular. That's already like crazy. People will be like, you mean you need multiple families because this vineyard is so huge? Yep, multiple families. Like the only kind of people that do this behavior in the ancient world are people that are the wealthiest of the wealthy. They got resources. And here they are waiting for a harvest. 5 years this vineyard owner would have to wait. So let's keep reading. Verse 10. At harvest time, he sent a servant to the tenants so that they would give him some of the fruit of the vineyard. But the tenants beat him and sent him away empty-handed. He sent another servant, but that one they also beat and treated shamefully and sent away empty-handed. He sent still a third, and they wounded him and threw him out. It's harvest time. This vineyard owner has waited a long, long time for this moment. He's poured countless resources into this venture, and now is time to even see a little return on investment. And what does he get? Nothing. His servants instead receive increasing levels of abuse. The tenants offend and insult the vineyard owner. They refuse to give what is due, and they are responding with violence. Like, this is a shocking development. And I have to ask you, what would you do in this situation? What would you do? What would you do if you had invested your life savings into a property only to have the tenants steal it right out from under you? I tell you what other property owners would do. They would lawyer up. They would call in the cops, they'd call in the authorities, they'd send all the lawyers, not just one or two. They'd be like, all of them, go. They would hit these people with every lawsuit in the books. But that's not what this vineyard owner does. He doesn't do that. Instead, this is what we read he does. Then the vineyard owner of the vineyard said, what shall I do? I will send my son, whom I love. Perhaps they will respect him. I don't think this makes a lot of sense, even in Jesus' day. Like, this guy should send in the tanks, but he sends his beloved son. Like, the only way to make sense of this is if somehow the vineyard owner believes that reconciliation is possible. This only makes sense if the vineyard owner desires mercy and not retribution. Because in an honor-shame culture, sending the son is the ultimate act of honor. It's the trump card. The son is the ultimate extension of the father. The son, unlike all those servants that have come, is a full legal representative. The son would be honored in any court case because he is the legal heir. And so whatever they do to the son, they do to the father and his estate. What did the tenants do? Well, we've read this. When the tenants saw him, they talked the matter over. They said, this is the heir. Let's kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. So they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. It's a twisted, wicked plan. And it really, like, as you sit with it, you're like, this doesn't make any sense. Like, how is it that they think they could take the inheritance for themselves when the vineyard owner is still alive? And now, to add insult to injury, he's grieving the death of his son. Like, what were they thinking? I think this is why Jesus asks the next question. What then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? He will come and kill those tenants and give the vineyard to others. When the people heard this, they said, God forbid. Why are they saying God forbid? Like, isn't that a weird reaction from the crowd? What are they hearing in this parable that would cause them to say that? We're going to come back to this in a second, but just keep that question in mind. Let's keep reading, verse 17. Jesus looked directly at them and asked, then what is the meaning of that which is written. The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces, and anyone on whom it falls will be crushed. The teachers of the law and the chief priests looked for a way to arrest him, Jesus, immediately, because they knew he had spoken this parable against them. But they were afraid of the people. So again, another really curious reaction from the chief priests and teachers of the law. Like, how is it that they knew this parable was against them? Like, usually people have no clue what the parable means. But here they're like, dude, he's calling us out. Let's arrest him. What is it that they're hearing so explicitly? What is Jesus saying in this parable? Well, the first thing to know is that everyone listening to this parable knew it was more than just an interesting story about a vineyard owner and his tenants. Everybody knew that Jesus was speaking about the relationship between Israel and God. How did they know this? Well, these people were fully immersed in the Torah. They knew their Hebrew scriptures. And this parable is like a hyperlink, a paraphrase of another story of a vineyard owner in the Bible. And that story is found in Isaiah. And this is what Isaiah says, speaking about God when he writes, "I will sing for the one I love, a song about his vineyard. My loved one had a vineyard on a fertile hillside. He dug it up and cleared it of stones and planted it with the choicest vines. He built a watchtower in it and cut out a wine press as well. Then he looked for a crop of good grapes, but it yielded only bad fruit. Now you dwellers in Jerusalem and people of Judea, judge between me and my vineyard. What more could have been done for my vineyard than I have done for it? When I looked for good grapes, why did it only yield bad? Now I will tell you what I'm going to do with my vineyard. I will take away its hedge, and it will be destroyed, and I will break down its wall, and it will be trampled." This is a prophecy that Isaiah speaks to the people of Israel before the destruction of the first temple and the exile. All the brokenness that led to the exile is what caused this story, this metaphor, this parable to be shared. The people bore bad fruit, and the result was destruction. And here, Jesus is in the second temple, and he's using the exact same metaphor. Only in this story of a vineyard owner, he's directing a word of judgment against the leadership of Israel, who are represented by the tenants. And this is why the crowd says, "God forbid." Like, they actually had an understanding that Jesus was saying Israel was not in a position to do whatever they want. They understood Jesus to be saying that, wait a minute, we could be going our own way and away from the love of God, away from the goodness and faithfulness and flourishing that God desires, and instead a path that leads to destruction. They say, "God forbid." The vineyard would be given to others. So that's already what people are understanding in this parable. The second thing that Jesus is doing in this parable is he's describing the willingness of God for reconciliation. Remember, it's really shocking in this story that the vineyard owner sends his beloved son. Like, in the same way that it is shocking in the story for the vineyard owner to do that, I think it's shocking to us that God sends his own son into the hostility of our broken world. That only makes sense if God so loved the world. It only makes sense if God's desire is to reconcile the world to himself. It only makes sense if God desires mercy. Which brings us to the next thing Jesus is doing in this parable. Jesus is explaining his own death. The death of Christ is a deep mystery of unending meaning. But here in this parable, the sending of the Son and his death is this picture of God's desire of reconciliation, that God so loved the world. But also at work in this parable is a bit of a diagnosis of what is leading to Jesus' death, of who would kill Jesus. You know, sometimes when we think about the meaning of the cross, we can sometimes distort it to say somehow that like God demanded the death of the Son in order to forgive or balance the books, or that somehow we can reinterpret John 3:16 to say God so hated the world that he needed to kill someone. Or we even say that the Father turned his face away. These are distortions about the ways we think about the cross. But here in this parable, Jesus is very clear about the meaning and the causes of his death. The violence towards the Son is at the hands of the tenants. And the violence towards Jesus would be the work of the religious and political systems of his day. Church, know that Jesus does not save us from God, but reveals God to us as Savior. And if anyone is holding the smoking gun for the death of Christ, it is our broken and twisted ways. This is the consistent message of how the death of Christ is preached in every single sermon in the book of Acts. Here are a few examples. This Jesus you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. You killed the author of life, whom, what did God do? Raised him from the dead. God raised up Jesus, whom you killed by hanging him on a tree, the righteous one you have now betrayed and murdered. Notice that it's not God that is to blame for suffering, injustice, and sin in our world. That is what we have done to the vineyard. But the good news is that the death of Christ has come to fix this problem. The death of Christ is not the end of the story. Because as Jesus will explain, his death becomes a decisive moment of how God is bringing healing and reconciliation to our broken world, to our twisted ways of thinking, to our broken vineyard. This is what he means when he quotes Psalm 118 saying, "The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone." What does he mean by that? Well, he's giving this image of in his day, before ancient builders built a house, they would pick stones for their building because they were making the stones, right? And often they would sort through their bricks as like a quality control. And before they laid them into place, they'd be like, this one's good, this one's bad, this one's good, this one's bad. And the stone the builders have rejected is saying that the builders have judged Jesus, the stone, as faulty. The religious leaders have cast him out. But God is taking their rejection and making it a cornerstone. In the ancient world, cornerstones are the most important part of a building. They literally are used to hold walls together. They're the structural integrity of a building. And this is all to say that here Jesus is teaching in the second temple, which has its own cornerstone, by the way. And he's saying like their rejection of him, their putting him to death, is going to be the foundation of the next thing God is doing. That the new temple that God is building in the world is happening through him and his death. The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Okay, the last thing Jesus is doing in this parable is that he is preparing us for a moment of surrender. If you remember the parable of the tenants, it ends pretty graphically. It ends with retribution, an eye for an eye. Like, he will come and kill those tenants and give the vineyard to others. And I think this kind of sets the expectation for us is that this is what should happen to all those who crucified Jesus. And in some ways, it metaphorically does. Like the vineyard of the kingdom is given to the apostles in the early church. But strikingly, when we look at the cross of Christ, we see no retribution. And this is a really important point. As Pope Benedict XVI put it, he said that it is on the cross that the parables are unlocked. The cross is the punchline of every parable. And on the cross, we do not see Jesus cry out for vengeance. He's not hanging there saying, God, kill that one, kill that one, kill that one. What does Jesus do on the cross? He pours out his life and yells, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Do you think the Father heard that prayer? On Good Friday, the sin of the world coalesced into a hideous singularity that upon the cross it was forgiven in mass. This is the justice of the cross. That enemies now can become friends, that forgiveness is offered to all, that mercy has come to break up the hardened soil of our broken ways, that God is in Christ reconciling the world to himself. Church, the cross of Christ invites us to a moment of surrender. In his arms outstretched, he invites all in to the new creation, to the cornerstone of the new ways of forgiveness and reconciliation. We are welcomed home if we would so choose. You know, one of the shocking things about this parable that Luke follows up later in his second book, the Acts of the Apostles, is that Luke has this really interesting story in Acts chapter 6. He says this, he's like, so the word of God spread, and the number of disciples in Jerusalem increased rapidly. And he has this throwaway line that's just amazing when you think about it. And a large number of priests became obedient to the death. To the faith. Who put Christ to death? The religious establishment. A large number of priests. I wonder if some of the very same people in the temple court that were breathing murderous threats later cried out in a moment of surrender. Friends, the stone the builders have rejected has become the cornerstone. And this is the story the gospel is telling, that grace is here. Would you please stand? Friends, so today, may you know that Jesus has announced forgiveness and reconciliation as open to all. May you know how much the Father loves you. May you know that he sent his Son into this world to bring you back home. And may you meet him in a moment of surrender today. Amen.
So, parables seem so effective in Jesus' day. Is there any opportunity for a modern day use of parables to share about Jesus?
Absolutely. In fact, I think narratives and parables are some of the most effective tools in our postmodern age, especially like when we tell stories, it invites people in always. And this is why one of the practices here at the meeting place is we invite people who are getting baptized to share what is true for you, because we don't want to miss those moments. And I think when we're sharing about Jesus, the story is so powerful. Often with people that are just checking out faith, I encourage them, why don't you just read the Gospel of John, right? Read the Gospels, encounter this Jesus for yourself, and bring your questions. I also think that another really effective format that we have that's actually running right now is our Alpha program. It's happening every Tuesday right now. And in Alpha, they tell the story of Jesus. And they invite people to share their own stories and their own struggles and pains. And we've seen tremendous fruit from Alpha. And so if you're here today and you're like, I'm not so sure about this Jesus guy, I'm not so sure about church, Tuesday night this week, come to Alpha.
Great, thank you so much for that. It seems like in your parable, Israel missed the red flags. How can we be assured that we don't do the same? What are some warning signs we can pay attention to when we seem to want the vineyard without the owner?
Well, that's such a great question. And for me, I think the warning signs are what we're putting at the center of our life. I think it's so easy in the Western world to put ourselves as the primary king of our lives. And I was listening to a dear teacher who shared here, Nasser Al-Khatani. He shared a couple weeks ago. But I was at this this General Assembly a couple weeks ago where he was sharing, and he had this just throwaway line that has just sat with me for a long time. And he said, you know what the master of your life is when your master tells you to do something you don't want to do. And I thought about that. I was like, yeah, that's huge. So I think, like, again, back to the heart of that question, how do we know, what are the red flags when we find ourselves moving away from Jesus at the center? When we say, okay, Jesus, I know you're calling me to this, but I don't want to. I think just pay attention to that. There's no shame in that. Like, God is with us even when sometimes it's 2 steps back. Just pay attention. Okay, what is this revealing? And I think if we're always asking the question in our life, what is the next step that will bring me into deeper intimacy, deeper Christ-likeness, deeper fruit of the Spirit, I think we're on a good trajectory.
That's great. One quick speed round question.
Speed round.
Sometimes the church can be a setting where it's hard to tell that we're friends. How can we be assured that we are friends here when, it just seems difficult? Yeah, well, first of all, I'll say, like, you're not going to be friends with everyone in this building right now. Like, accept that. Even Jesus had the 72, the 12, and the 3. You're going to have different levels of relationship. For me, I think the deepest level of friendship you can have in this church is our home church environments. There are people that gather pretty much every day of the week in their homes where they take the chairs and they face each other. And like, if you are desiring to be known, because I think that's how you really know your friend, when they know your story and you know theirs, and you make a story together, the best place for that is in our home churches. And if you're not in a home church today, I'd encourage you, come talk to Nicole. So she would love to have a conversation about that. Great, thanks so much. Would you close this morning?
I would love to close. Would you please stand with me? Today is St. Patrick's Day, so I want to lead us in a call and response prayer based off the prayer of St. Patrick. And just so you know, in ancient times and in ancient places, those that wanted to receive a blessing held out their hand like this. And those that wanted to give a blessing held out their hands like this. I send you out with these words. Please read the words in bold. So Christ is beside me. Christ is before me. Christ is behind me, King of my heart. Christ is within me. Christ is below me. Christ is above me, never to part. Christ on my right hand, Christ on my left hand, Christ all around me, shield in the strife. Christ in my sleeping, Christ in my sitting, Christ in my rising, light of my life. Christ is beside me, Christ is before me, Christ is behind me, King of my heart. Christ is within me, Christ is below me, Christ is above me, never depart. And so may you go in the knowledge that Christ goes with you. May you arise today through a mighty strength, the invocation of the Trinity, through belief in the threeness, through the confession of the oneness of the Creator of creation. Amen.